What's up YouTube? I'm Starbomber, and today we continue our plane posting through the Century series with the Lockheed Martin F-104 Starfighter. This aircraft would pick up a number of nicknames over its career, but the most infamous would be Widowmaker, given to it by the German public. We'll cover the Starfighter's development and its long history of being operated by countries other than the United States, including one that may surprise you, as it definitely surprised me. Through all of this, we will answer the question, what was the last Starfighter? The F-104 was developed by legendary Lockheed designer Clarence Kelly Johnson. Kelly had worked on the P-38, the P-80 Shooting Star, and would go on to work on the SR-71 Blackbird. The Lockheed team were attempting a new design theory. In 1951, Kelly traveled to Korea to interview pilots who had been fighting Soviet MiGs during the Korean conflict. The pilots were overall impressed with the Soviet planes, and they were beginning to lament the high weight and complexity of their own aircraft. The Skunk Works team got together afterwards to compile a fast, light jet that could climb well, and just in time, the Air Force was looking for a replacement for the F-100 Super Sabre. Though the Super Sabre was new at the time, the Air Force was aware that this technological superiority wouldn't last. The Super Sabre was also, in many ways, the previous war's jet fighter. Sure, the F-100 is often cited as one of the first so-called second-generation jet fighters, but in reality it was just a scaled-up F-86 with a stronger engine and a more aggressive wing sweep. It could break the sound barrier, but it was heavy, and it was a day fighter. The first few versions didn't feature radars. There was a trend in aircraft design where aircraft tended to become heavier as more and more components were added. Even back then, this was a concern for Kelly and the Lockheed team. They knew that someone would have to come up with a light fighter to buck the trend of all these heavy fighters. The design they came up with was laser focused on obtaining the highest speed. It was small and light. It used a massive engine for its size though, the General Electric JG-79, a new variable turbine jet engine. They wanted the engine to be swapped by a small team. They wanted the entire aircraft to be small enough to not require any large-scale maintenance equipment, and they wanted it to be low mass. The Starfighter used a unique trapezoidal wing, and this wing was thin. It was so thin, in fact, that ground crews had to install guards on it when it was parked to prevent themselves from being cut on the sharp trailing edge. The Starfighter also featured an interesting escape system, one that fired the pilot down through the floor of the plane. Think of this engineering challenge. You want to escape from a plane moving at Mach 2. How would you do it? At that speed, the airflow is so great that you probably couldn't even open the canopy. This could be solved with explosive bolts or some kind of spring-loaded hatch, but then you face more problems. The supersonic airstream would buffet you as you tried to climb out. It would be comparable to getting hit by a wall of bricks. In addition, as you try to jump clear of the plane, you would have to worry about being hit by the airplane itself. And on a jet plane, there is the jet intake, which could easily ingest a pilot. To solve all of these problems, in the late 40s and early 50s, aircraft began to use ejector seats. An ejector seat uses a rocket motor to propel the pilot away from the aircraft, far enough that they can safely deploy a parachute and float back down to Earth without having to worry about hitting the plane on the way. There were a number of ejection catapults proposed, even during the Second World War, though the Starfighter posed some challenges for traditional ejector seat technology. The vertical stabilizer was especially tall, 13.5 feet tall. The rocket motors of the time weren't able to clear it. Lockheed designers decided to go around that problem and simply fire the seat down through the floor. At 38,000 feet and 900 miles per hour, this makes some amount of sense. At that speed and height, it doesn't really matter which way you eject, as long as it carries you away from the aircraft. The problem is that the majority of aircraft incidents do not occur at these kinds of altitudes and airspeeds. Most aircraft incidents happen at low altitude and low airspeed, and 21 Air Force pilots were killed in Starfighters where the investigation concluded they could not escape due to the low altitude. Midway through the Starfighter's career, due to these incidents, as well as several other ground and low altitude accidents with other jets, the Starfighter eventually began to receive new 0-0 ejection seats that were safe to use at 0 altitude and 0 airspeed. The Starfighter was designed to fit as many weapons into the small size as it could. It carried a powerful airborne search radar. It was also one of the first American jets to be equipped with the M61 Vulcan cannon, a 20mm rotary autocannon that could output a staggering number of bullets in a short time. The Starfighter didn't carry all that much ammunition though, as a pilot could deplete it with just 7 seconds of continuous firing. It was also equipped with mounts for air-to-air missiles, at the time aimed for Falcons, but eventually the Starfighter would be equipped with the whole range of NATO missile weapons, in addition to bombs. The Starfighter paid for all these weapons with fuel. A notoriously short-ranged aircraft, the Air Force went so far as to completely remove the Vulcan cannon from the A-model Starfighters to replace it with a fuel tank. Later models of the Starfighter would all carry wingtip fuel tanks to try and add some range to the jet. The Starfighter would find itself deployed to Europe with other Century fighters during the Berlin Crisis. Starfighters would also be sent to Vietnam, though their combat record in theater would be rather dubious, not scoring a single air-to-air kill, though they did play a role in screening airborne early warning and control aircraft. The Starfighter didn't only serve with the military. NASA, the National Air and Space Administration, or rather its predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, would acquire a number of surplus Starfighters for research purposes. These aircraft were some of the fastest NASA had, and they were used as chase aircraft to research rockets, such as the X-15. One of them earned the nickname Howling Howard, due to the distinctive sound of the J-79, as its turbine reached certain speeds and compression ratios. In the 1960s, the Starfighter was busy being phased out of American service, but across Europe, the fear of the Soviets was pushing countries to search for a jet fighter of their own. Lockheed came, bearing gifts, their F-104 blueprint, and fat stacks of cash. The bribery was so bad, it triggered a congressional investigation. Despite the grift, there would still be many versions of the F-104 produced for NATO countries, the most famous probably being the F-104G, destined for West Germany. It was here that the Starfighter earned perhaps its most infamous reputation. Of the 915 Starfighters procured for the West German Republic, 292 of them would be lost in crashes. Even before the Starfighter came into service, Luftwaffe pilots were dubious about it. Erich Hartmann, probably the most deadly pilot in Germany, commented that the Starfighter was unsafe and unfit for air combat conditions. The Starfighter would continue to serve with the West German Air Force until 1973. There is another Starfighter operator, though, one far from the eyes of Europe, and one that would put the Starfighter through the fiercest combat the platform would ever see. In the late 1940s, Pakistan was a new country. Created from colonial India after the partition, the new countries immediately began bickering over where the border was to be, and both countries began arming themselves. Pakistan, for aircraft, had always had their eye on American designs. The Pakistan Air Force had originally wanted to acquire the rights to build F-86 Sabres in their own country, though that deal never went through. However, in 1961, a squadron of 14 F-104s was formed in Pakistan. These F-104s were originally A models that had been in service with the US. At the request of the PAF, these F-104s had their engines upgraded to the latest version of the JG-79. They had new avionics installed, and they had the spare fuselage fuel tank removed. And the Vulcan cannon was put back. These were, at the time, the most powerful starfighters in service. And they were just in time, too. Before I get into this, I want to stress that this is a conflict between two sides who are eager to play up any victory for propaganda purposes. Numbers were exaggerated, stories were spun up by papers and the government, and finding the truth is difficult for real researchers, let alone for a guy plane posting for fun. But here's what I know. In 1963, the First Indo-Pakistani War erupted over the contested Kashmir region. The rest of the military had not initially been informed of the Army's plans, so the first few weeks of the war were a chaotic scramble, as units relocated. Though the starfighters proved their power early on, making supersonic passes of Indian air bases, screaming into fallen knots and sabers dogfighting, and overall being a high-speed menace. They even intercepted a number of Canberra bombers attempting to attack PAF bases. The starfighters' role in this conflict is quite small tactically. It was certainly the most advanced plane of the conflict, but there were only 14 of them, operating out of only one squadron, and the Starfighter is not known for being a long-ranged aircraft. In addition, the majority of the conflict took place in the mountainous Kashmir region, terrain that doesn't favor the high-speed, low-agility Starfighter. The aircraft spooked the Indians, though, as even before the war, they were aware it far outclassed them. The Starfighter would earn another nickname for the Indian Air Force pilots, Badmash, which roughly translates to hooligan or scoundrel. In 1971, hostilities began again, this time over the other Pakistan, which was later called Bangladesh. By this time, the Indian Air Force had their own homegrown fighter jet, the Marut, which was at least the equal of the Starfighter in many respects. Also by this time, the Pakistanis' ability to keep the high-speed jets in order was wearing thin. The jets were sorely lacking in spare parts, and many of them needed major overhauls. In the end, the PAF grounded their starfighters for the last time in 1972. Another major non-NATO power to receive starfighters was Taiwan. The small island nation would operate the fighter for several years before finally retiring their last starfighter in 1996. Starfighters were actually shipped to Taiwan as cargo aboard other aircraft. A defueled and partially disassembled starfighter was small enough and light enough to fit inside of a C-124 Globemaster. An air battle eventually occurred between a wing of starfighters flying combat air patrol and a flight of People's Republic Air Force MiG-19s flying over the contested Kinmen Island. 2 MiG-19s were shot down, but a starfighter was lost, reported as missing in action. Kelly Johnson himself said of this incident that we had them at steady state altitude, and we had them in acceleration, but we could not turn with them. which would be something of a theme for American jets up against MiG-19s. Plans to develop an improved version of the Starfighter fell through. The Air Force was busy procuring more, heavier fighters, while in the rest of the world, most people had grown tired of Lockheed's meddling. But there was one nation looking to obtain starfighters still, and they would end up operating them for far longer than anyone else. The Italians did operate a small number of F-104Gs, but in 1966, these aircraft were showing their age, the small wings needed to be replaced, a number of aircraft had been lost to accidents, though not as great a number as West Germany, and the Italians were looking for an all-weather interceptor. They looked at many designs, but eventually they chose a design designated CL-901, called the Super Starfighter. This aircraft was longer than the original F-104G, but Fiat already had factories spun up to produce the F-104G, so they produced a test aircraft first. This plane passed its flight trials, and would eventually be known as the Air Italia F-104S. Production would begin in earnest in 1966. Some of the latest starfighters built, and they would continue to be produced well into the 80s. Italy kept these starfighters in service for years. The last one eventually retired as late as 2005, though it was not without controversy, as in Italy too, there were serious questions about the aircraft's reliability and safety. With hindsight, we can see that the F-104 was certainly a problematic aircraft, suffering from design trade-offs, challenging to fly, often placed into the hands of pilots with not enough hours behind the stick. But aviation has always been a dangerous field. The faster an aircraft flies and the more it pushes the boundaries of the technology of its day, the more likely it is to suffer accidents. The F-104 was a serviceable jet for certain countries, and even for civilian research applications, as with its Mach 2 speed, it is certainly fast. In fact, the last starfighters are not military at all. There is a company operating out of Kennedy Space Center called Starfighters Incorporated, which actively flies F-104s for commercial and government work, and these are the last starfighters. Next time on Planeposting.